Today, in the Russian Orthodox world, it is Christmas Day. May I first of all take this opportunity to wish everybody who celebrates Christmas on this day a very happy Christmas. May all your desires come true. May you enjoy this most joyful holiday with your friends, your family, with yourselves, and a blessings towards all of you. Well, as I said, today is Christmas Day. There's been a great deal of speculation over the last couple of days, weeks even, that President Putin of Russia would announce a Christmas Day truce or a Christmas truce on this day, as he did last year. In the event, he has not done so. President Putin has made a brief address to the Russian people on Christmas Day, but it did not include any reference to a Christmas truce. He also met with families of soldiers who have died over the course of the special military operation, as the Russians refer to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. He hosted them at a dinner. He spoke with them extensively, but again, at no point over the course of that meeting did he announce any sort of Christmas truce. So the conclusion must be that this year, having attempted a Christmas truce last year, the Russians have decided that this year they're not going to go down that road. And it is understandable why. In last year, at this time, when Putin did announce a Christmas truce, he did it, I think, for two reasons. Firstly, the war was still relatively recent at that time. The first anniversary of the war had not yet been reached. The first anniversary, I should say, of the current conflict, the one that started in February 2022, had not been reached. Russians and many Ukrainians would say that the conflict actually began long before. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that discussion in this program. But the armed conflict, the fighting, the open conflict, the fighting between Russia and Ukraine last year had only been underway for less than a year. And one can understand why someone like President Putin, wanting to emphasize the connections between Russians and Ukrainians, who he has repeatedly said are two branches of the same tree, of the Russian people, why he would want to have a Christmas truce, one which also, by the way, at that time referenced the fact that both in Russia and Ukraine, Christmas is celebrated on the same day. Well, since then, a year has passed, the war has continued, there's been many hundreds of thousands of people killed and wounded, and though President Putin has in no way retreated from his position that Russians and Ukrainians are two branches of the same tree, in fact, he has gone further along it. He no longer speaks of them as fraternal people. He now, as I said, increasingly talks of them as being one and the same people, different branches of one tree. But though he has gone in no way retreated from that position, I think he understands that certainly whilst the present government in Kiev remains in power, concessive actions like announcing a Christmas truce are not going to be reciprocated. But there is, of course, another reason why President Putin would be unwilling this year to grant a Christmas truce or offer a Christmas truce as he did last year, which is that you could argue that last year it was the Russians, in effect, who were playing for time. They launched the special military operation in February 2022. It is now clear that the forces that the Russians had committed to the special military operation were relatively small, relative by the standards of what we are seeing deployed now, that the initial purpose of the special military operation was not to subjugate the whole of Ukraine. In fact, and it is continuously overlooked, President Putin actually explained this clearly in a meeting he had with the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, almost the day that the special military operation began. He explained to President Aliyev that he was not looking to conquer the whole of Ukraine. He was clearly seeking some kind of diplomatic and political resolution. And though this is not something that Western leaders want to acknowledge, the fact is that all of his actions in the days and weeks that followed confirmed this. On the very second day of the special military operation, after President Zelensky of Ukraine indicated that Ukraine would seek negotiations with Russia and was no longer going to seek membership of NATO, President Putin announced a temporary one-day truce to enable Ukrainian negotiators to arrive in Belarus and to begin negotiations with the Russians there. And though that truce, which one suspects was unpopular, to put it mildly, with Russian military commanders, ended the following day when the Ukrainian negotiators failed to turn up. Nonetheless, negotiations did begin. The negotiations continued through February and March, and eventually they resulted in that meeting in Istanbul at the end of March, when a draft agreement, points of agreement between Ukraine and Russia were reached, enabling the negotiators on both sides to initial the document. As I have discussed many, many times, and again, this is something that some people in the West want to deny. There was an article to that effect in the National Interest recently, for example, which I discussed in a program recently. Clearly, what was initialed in Istanbul was not a final document. There had been many months of negotiations still to go, but the outlines of the general settlement between Russia and Ukraine were there. There was enough ground, common ground reached so as to make possible a cessation of hostilities. The Russians, President Putin, as a goodwill gesture, and this now seems to be confirmed, agreed to withdraw their forces from Kiev, and it was widely expected in Moscow at that time that the objective, the original objective of the special military operation, the one that had been behind the decision to launch it in February, to force the Ukrainians to negotiate, to get them to agree to a political resolution of the conflict between themselves and Russia, one which would keep Ukraine outside NATO, one which would secure the position of Donbass and Crimea going forward, one which would secure Russian core security interests. Well, it seemed to the Russians at that point that that agreement had almost been reached and that peace was round the corner. Well, as I've discussed in many programs, things turned out otherwise. The West made it clear that they did not support, in fact, that they strongly opposed the outline agreement reached in Istanbul. Ukraine withdrew from the agreement. Subsequently, President Zelensky enacted a law, issued a decree which forbade him or any other Ukrainian official from negotiating with the Russians at all, so long as President Putin remained in office and the present government in Russia remained in office. And eventually, over the course of the summer, it became clear to the Russians that the war, which they hoped would soon be over, had in fact only just begun. And that realization found the Russians in an awkward position. Their forces were too few, they were overextended. Ukraine was receiving large numbers of weapons from the West. It had mobilized hundreds of thousands of men. It was about to go on the offensive, and in the autumn, late summer and autumn of 2022, it actually did so. And in light of that, and the Ukrainian advances in Kharkiv and Kherson, the Russians, therefore, were aiming to play for time. They needed time in order to build up their defenses. They needed time in order to weaken the Ukrainian air defense system, as I have discussed in recent programs. They needed time in order to increase the number of men in their armed forces, to bring the regiments on the battle lines fully up to strength, to train the men that would be needed to conduct the war. And they also needed time to crank up production of military equipment to the level that would be needed to re-equip their armed forces and to put them in a position of decisive material advantage. And given that they needed time, the logic of a Christmas truce, had Ukraine agreed to it last year, would have made complete sense. Well, this year we are in a completely different situation. The Russians have repelled Ukraine's great summer offensive. That was, as I have labored to point out, not a Ukrainian offensive that failed. It was a Ukrainian offensive which the Russians decisively and conclusively defeated. The Russians have been steadily building up their armed forces, and they're now in a position of increasing advantage over the Ukrainians in almost all material terms, and the gap is growing. And instead of the Ukrainians being on the advance, and the Ukrainians and their Western allies planning an offensive, it is the Russians who are advancing and who are perhaps planning an offensive. So a ceasefire that made strategic sense last year makes no sense today. Politically, it clearly isn't going to achieve anything. And militarily, granting a ceasefire at this time would only give the Ukrainians a respite, when the entire objective of the Russians at the present time is to exact as much attrition on Ukraine, on its military, as possible, to continue to weaken the Ukrainians, to give them no rest, no time to reorganize and re-equip, to continue to press them on every part of the front line in preparation for whatever big plan the Russians have in the future. So that is why we have no Christmas truce this year. And as a matter of fact, we are continuing to receive a certain number of reports from the battlefronts in Ukraine. They're not huge numbers of reports. It's difficult sometimes to understand what all of these reports mean. And I should say that, as I've said previously, this being the Christmas holiday for Russians and for Ukrainians, or many Ukrainians as well. It is unsurprising, perhaps, that we're getting fewer reports from the battlefronts at the moment than we have been in the recent past. But all of the reports which we are getting, as I have been saying in several programs recently, many programs recently, they all point to the same picture. The Russians continuing to conduct what Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, and Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, the Russian general staff, the person who is the overall commander of forces in the conflict zone, the man who Polish reports were claiming a few days ago had been killed in the fighting, but whom the Ukrainians have now confirmed has not been killed. Anyway, both Shoigu and Gerasimov have explained current Russian tactics as the Russians continuing to remain on active defense, but pushing forward whenever the opportunity presents itself and increasing the territory within their zone of control. And we see this happen in every part of the front line, except, in my opinion, one, which I will come to in a moment. So firstly, we got more reports yesterday of further Russian advances towards the Oskol River. The Russians continue to push steadily in the Oskol River sector towards Liman and possibly Siversk as well. Dima at the military summary channel says that there's been a build-up of Ukrainian forces trying to parry these Russian advances. I would again point out that since we're talking about a Russian strategy of active defense, of attrition, of wearing down the Ukrainians, getting the Ukrainians to deploy more of their reserves to the front lines to try to stop or slow Russian advances fits exactly within the Russian plan. From a Russian point of view, even if their advance on, say, Liman is slower than it might otherwise have been, because the Ukrainians are deploying more forces to the front lines. All that means is that more Ukrainian units are being committed to the battle, more Ukrainian soldiers are being forced to fight, more Ukrainian equipment is being expended, and the Ukrainians are struggling to replace those losses, even as Russian strength steadily grows. So, further Russian advances in the Oskol River area. And there's been reports also that the Russians are making further headway in the Bakhmut area. Again, you can find these reports in various places, but it seems that the Russians are now advancing in a cemetery area west of Bakhmut, south of Bogdanovka, this village which the Russians clearly now control a significant part of, and where the fighting continues. This cemetery area, according to various people, is of great strategic significance if it is captured by the Russians, and the Russians do seem to have entered it and are perhaps in the process of capturing it. Well, supposedly, if the Russians capture the cemetery, they will be able to move forward to a wooded area referred to or referenced as the Popova forest. I doubt that it's actually much of a forest. Once that is cleared of Ukrainian troops, Ukrainian positions further south in the area of Klashayevka, Kordumyovka will apparently be in great jeopardy. The Ukrainian positions in Ivanivska will be in jeopardy also, and it would open the way to further Russian advances towards the canal to the west of Bakhmut and ultimately towards Chasiv Yar, if it is indeed the Russian objective to capture Chasiv Yar. So more Russian advances there. And there's also been reports that the Russians are continuing to push forward in the Marinka area, in the village of Avdiivka to the west. We've been hearing less about the fighting in Novomikhailivka over the last couple of days, but I suspect the fighting there is pretty intense as well. And lastly, or not quite lastly, there continue to be reports that the Russians are carrying very heavy fire attacks, pushing the Ukrainians steadily northwards in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, weakening, reducing the areas of Ukrainian control in that part of the front line, the area where Ukraine made its biggest gains during its summer offensive at horrific cost. And one gets the sense that in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, and again in other places, the Russians are not in any great hurry, because Ukraine continues to try to defend these ephemeral gains that it achieved over the course of the summer. And as even a brief examination of any map will show, doing so simply leaves Ukrainian troops in what is in effect now a large fire sack. It's sometimes referred to as Bradley Square, by the way. A fire sack in which they're surrounded by the Russians on three sides and where the Russians control nearly all the high ground. So, again, why interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake? If the Ukrainians want to keep their troops there or even reinforce them, because it would be a bad look to pull them back after all the fighting and time that was spent trying to capture these positions, why prevent them doing so when, again, let them doing so, let them send more troops into this area trying to hold these positions, simply increases the rate of attrition, which is what the Russians are focused on. And the same, of course, applies to the Krinky bridgehead. Now, it's been very interesting to read, again, the British Ministry of Defence briefings. The British Ministry of Defence has run out of good things to say about the war in Ukraine. It's been plugging hard for several weeks the Ukrainian victories, supposedly in the Black Sea. I have already discussed how this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what has happened in the Black Sea. But anyway, the British Ministry of Defence has now suddenly discovered that the Ukrainians successfully shot down 3 Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers at the end of December, and supposedly the Russians have never succeeded at any point since then in re-establishing air superiority in Kherson region, and that allegedly is why the Krinky bridgehead still continues. Well, it's interesting, actually. It's an interesting briefing because, of course, the Ukrainians claim that they shot down more than 3 Sukhoi 34s. The British have decided that the number 3 is the one they're going to run with. I know not on what information. The Russian sources suggest, the more reliable Russian sources that I have seen, suggest that it was only 1 Sukhoi 34. I'm not going to argue the point. I don't know one way or the other. But we've had an accumulation of reports over the last week or so that Ukrainian air defenses west of the Dnieper River have been hammered by the Russians, that a train with a Patriot missile system or parts of one was destroyed in Kherson region. We've seen pictures, there have been pictures provided of successful attacks by Russian Lancet drones on IRIS-T anti-aircraft batteries west of the Dnieper River in Kherson region. And even as the British Ministry of Defence tells us that the Russians have failed to reassert air superiority in this area, we're getting reports that in fact the Russians have resumed bombing with airdropped bombs on Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper. So there we are. It looks as if the British Defence Ministry is not only struggling to find good news, but when it does find good news, that good news has already become out of date. It's not the first time, by the way. But anyway, those are the places where the Russians continue to exact attrition. And in fact, there's been a rather sad film of two Ukrainian boats trying to reach the Krinky bridgehead, presumably sending reinforcements and supplies, being caught by the Russians. One of these boats is clearly attacked, hit. There's a big explosion. You can see something happened to the boat. The other boat appears to be trying to escape. Heavens knows what happened to it or to the people upon it. But the accumulating evidence, again, is that just as has happened with Bradley Square in the Zaporozhye region, and exactly as President Putin himself said about 2 weeks ago, the Krinky bridgehead, as far as the Russians are concerned, is just another Ukrainian fire sack where some of Ukraine's most elite brigades, its marine brigades, are also experiencing appalling attrition. Where is the one place where the Russians, I think, are not conducting attrition? Well, I suspect it is Avdiivka. And again, we're getting more news about events there, and they do all point once more to steady, though undramatic, Russian advances. Now, there's been more reports this morning of further Russian advances north up the railway, that more fortified positions that the Ukrainians controlled in this area have now been cleared. The information is sketchy and uncorroborated, but for what it's worth, it exists. And as I have also said, there's accumulating evidence now that the Russians continue to make advances within Avdiivka itself to the southwest of where the fighting on the railway is taking place. And I suspect that at some point over the next few weeks, we will see a further commitment of Russian troops to sorting out the problem of Avdiivka, ending the battle there, bringing this particular town under full Russian control. And, well, Western commentators have spoken about the grave consequences for Ukraine if such a development were to happen. And General Zaluzhny himself has, of course, come forward and said that he believes that the Russians will capture Avdiivka at some point in the next 2 to 3 months. So there we go. That, I think, is one area where the Russians do indeed intend to gain ground and to gain control, and where they will do so at some point, maybe in the next few weeks, maybe in the next few months, much as General Zaluzhny says. But even here, despite the fact that the Russians, once again, are conducting what might be described as aggressive attrition on the Ukrainians, but also seeking to make these advances, you could see how the attrition is working to their advantage, because Avdiivka has become so important to the Ukrainians, is such a key position that once more we get reports of Ukraine forced to deploy reinforcements to Avdiivka, just as it is doing, along the Oskol River, draining further its reserves, reducing the numbers of its trained men, and obliged to continue the battle at a time when it urgently needs to have its army rest and refit. Well, there has been some further Western commentary highlighting the discrepancies in the military balance between Ukraine and Russia. And there is an article in the Wall Street Journal, one which is attracting a great deal of attention, one which shows the difference between levels of artillery use in the summer and now. And if you believe this article, then in the summer, Ukraine was firing around 7,000 rounds of artillery a day, which was more than the Russians were firing, supposedly at that time. Supposedly the Russians were firing around 5,000 rounds of shells a day. And this was at the height of the Ukrainian offensive. I should say straight away that though I suspect the Ukrainian figure is correct, it corresponds very closely with guesstimates that I was making way back in the summer of Ukraine's artillery use. I guessed that on particular days, over some periods, Ukraine might fire around 10,000 rounds a day in order to support an offensive, and I accept that this is probably not the case on every single day, and that maybe it did average, especially towards the end of the offensive, at around, in the late summer, in August, maybe perhaps 7,000 rounds a day. I am far more skeptical about the Russian number of 5,000 rounds a day. I remember people at the time claiming that the Ukrainians had achieved some kind of superiority over the Russians in artillery. I was skeptical at the time. I know many other commentators are, but it does seem as if whoever it is who's come up with this chart for the Wall Street Journal still thinks that. Anyway, today, according to the Wall Street Journal, Ukrainian use of artillery has reduced. Ukraine is only able to fire 2,000 rounds a day, whereas Russian artillery use has increased to 10,000 rounds a day. So, whereas in the summer it was 7,000 for Ukraine against 5,000 for Russia, today things have got far worse for Ukraine, according to the Wall Street Journal. The Russians fire on any one day 5 shells for every shell that the Ukrainians fire. It's 10,000 against 2. I'm going to say straight away that again, I think these figures may be wrong. I personally suspect that 2,000 rounds a day may even overstate the number of rounds that Ukraine is able to launch. There have been many accounts from Ukrainian soldiers, artillerymen, which have appeared in the media in the West, in which they say that whereas they were firing around 100 shells a day in the summer at the height of the offensive, that number has reduced to catastrophic levels to about 15 a day today, and that many of the shells that they're able to fire are duds. In some cases, it's even less than that. I seem to remember that one artillery soldier said that he's only able to fire 5 shells a day. And I recall that in those Pentagon documents that were leaked at the start of this year, it was conceded that the number of shells that Ukraine was firing at the beginning of March on any one day had fallen to around 1,000, and that the number of shells held in reserve had also depleted to catastrophically low levels. Of course, subsequently, Ukraine received a huge infusion of shells from South Korea and the European Union, and to some extent from the United States, for its summer offensive. But anyway, given that that arsenal of shells has now been apparently lost, fired away, and given that the United States has been struggling to keep up supplies of shells and has to supply shells to Israel as well, I suspect that 2,000 rounds a day by Ukraine might be actually an optimistic number. As for the Russians, 10,000 shells a day would be less, significantly less, than what they were using this time last year, when I seem to recall that they were firing around 20,000 a day. Now, there's always this uncertainty about Russian production numbers of shells, though everybody concedes that it has increased hugely. There's also uncertainty about the size of Russian stockpiles. There's the mystery of the shells that Russia is supposed to have received from North Korea. But what I will say is this. Again, I follow very closely what Russian telegram channels say. Russian telegram channels, some of them are very close to the soldiers on the front lines, and I have seen no sign that they are forced or obliged to restrict use of shells. In fact, on the contrary, there seems to be a general consensus that Russian artillery today is in a better condition of supply than it has been at other periods during this conflict. So it could be that 10,000 shells a day on the Russian side is also an underestimate. Just guessing. Now, one way or the other, even if I'm wrong about all of this, the fact remains that the Wall Street Journal accepts that the Russians are firing 5 times more shells on any one day than the Ukrainians are, and it also seems to concede that this gap is likely to widen over the next few months. Given which, it is most unsurprising that the Russians are advancing and that the Ukrainians are retreating. And bear in mind that we also have the Russians now regularly bombing the Ukrainians, which of course they weren't doing earlier in the war. As I've discussed, the Russian Air Force is now much more active than it was this time last year. We have Russian aerial bombs being dropped on a regular basis, precision-guided glide bombs appearing in many parts of the battlefronts at various weights, and we also have the very heavy use by both sides of drones, but it is universally acknowledged that in drone warfare, the Russians are outmatching the Ukrainians and that the margins are growing there as well. So, an article in the Wall Street Journal that concedes that the discrepancy in terms of shells and shell use is growing, and that it heavily favors the Russians. And we have another article today in the Financial Times. Russia has the upper hand in electronic warfare with Ukraine. And it says that both Kiev and Moscow seek to bolster drone jamming capabilities as attacks mount. And indeed, they are. And there's much that is happening on that front. And the article goes on to acknowledge that the Russians have a clear advantage in use of drones and jamming systems. And again, one gets the sense that some of the people who are interviewed for this article, I'm not going to read the article, it's fairly long, that some of the people who are interviewed for this article realize that the gap in capability is widening. Now, the article does say that the Ukrainians have been urgently asking the Western powers to make up the difference, to provide them with more advanced electronic warfare equipment. There's suggestions that the West can do this, that the Russians suffer from various technological gaps and such things, and that if the West really commits to making the difference in terms of electronic jamming, then it can and should be successful. I get to say briefly about that entire argument, which is, as I said, very much there in this article, falls up against this perennial fallacy that has distorted Western actions throughout this crisis. This belief that the West enjoys some great technological advantage over the Russians. It has been proved wrong time after time. It's been proved wrong with the HIMARS system. It's been proved wrong with the artillery pieces, which have proved, the Western ones have proved too fragile to be used. The claim that they outrange the Russian guns is turned out to be wrong. All of those things. It's turned out to be especially wrong with the tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, which have also turned out to be too fragile for use on the battle lines, the Western ones, and which have been at least equaled, if not surpassed, by Russian tanks. There is an interesting article in one American military magazine, I believe it's called Military Watch. Again, I've forgotten the name. But it actually compares Western tanks on the battle lines with the T-80. This is not the most advanced Russian tank, but it is a tank that the Soviet Union developed in the late 1970s and 1980s. If you want an understanding of the T-80 tank, let me once again reference the article, the books rather I should say, by Jim Kinnair. He is far and away the best writer on Russian military vehicles. He actually has toured the factories. He's sometimes spoken to some of the designers. He's actually had contact with the Russian Defense Ministry. He's even managed to get the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu himself, to write a brief preface to one of his books. And Jim Kinnair is also an engineer and somebody who understands production and also design and equipment. And I understand that he also has a military background as well. So he is in all respects the best, most authoritative person to write about these things. And he has consistently spoken about the nature and capabilities of Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. And The T-80 is one of the vehicles that he has in fact talked about. Anyway, this article, this latest article in this American magazine says many of the things which I am sure, if you have been reading Jim Kinnair's books, which I have been doing, by the way, would not surprise you. That the gas turbine engine that the T-80 has, which is a engine based on a completely different design philosophy, by the way, than the one used by the Abrams tank. It's based on a helicopter engine, whereas I believe that the one of the Abrams tank is not. It's more like a jet engine. But anyway, I'm not going to go into those kind of details. Anyway, that this engine has provided the T-80 tank with a degree of agility and mobility on the battlefield that Western tanks cannot match, and that this has proved extremely important in actual battlefield use. And unlike the Abrams' engine, the engine of the T-80 tank apparently is able to work quite effectively and efficiently on the battlefields. It's much more rugged and reliable than the rather brittle engine used by the Abrams. And the tank has a much better, higher power-to-weight ratio than the Abrams does, which explains its agility on the battlefield. So the myth that Western tanks were better than Russian tanks, well, that's been discredited as well. But here again, you see another article in the Financial Times coming up with this latest theory that actually, even if Western air defense systems and tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and multiple launch rocket systems and artillery are not better than the Russian, well, electronic jamming systems, Western electronic jamming systems must be. After all, the Russians supposedly are short of advanced chips and the necessary equipment to make advanced electronic jammers. This despite the fact that it has always been acknowledged, going all the way back to the middle periods of the Cold War, that first the Soviets and then the Russians invested far more heavily in electronic jamming than the Western powers did. But nonetheless, it is taken as axiomatic in this article that if the West really puts its mind to it, they can somehow surpass Russian capabilities in this field where the Russians are acknowledged to be currently preeminent. But is it actually even true? Is it actually true that the West does have this preeminence in this field? Well, setting aside that in all the other sectors where it's assumed that the West has had preeminence, it's turned out that it doesn't. What makes us think that in electronic warfare, the West is really so much better? After all, in radar equipment, in processing, in data processing, the Russians don't seem to be that far behind. They do have, as I've discussed many times, a very significant radio electronics industry of their own. But more importantly, or at least decisively, and this is a point which, again, these articles consistently disregard and overlook, even if in some technologies the West is indeed ahead. Let's assume that in some areas in the electronic warfare field, in some of the subcomponents, the West is ahead of Russia, and the Russians would struggle to come up quickly with alternatives to what the West has, or their own versions of what the West has. Russia now is close strategic partner of today's military, industrial, technological colossus, which is, of course, China. The Chinese are certainly capable of producing all of this equipment. In fact, they're probably already doing so. They've shown that they can produce advanced chips. They produced 2 advanced chips over the course of 2023, when it was assumed that they would not be able to produce any. And I have no doubt that the Chinese could easily, or at least quickly, supply the Russians with any things of this nature that they needed, and probably do so from their own production. And of course, the Russians also have excellent relations with other countries, including India, where, let us remember, much of the best programming actually takes place. So again, I'm not pointing any fingers. I'm not saying that Indian programmers are in any way involved in Russian military programs, but do note that when Foreign Minister Jaishankar visited Moscow last week and met with Putin and Lavrov and had a 5-day meeting that visit there, and is preparing the ground for Prime Minister Modi to visit Russia, Jaishankar discussed with the Russians the possibility of joint production of weapons, with some Russian weapons being produced in India, primarily, of course, for the Indian military, but perhaps for the Russian military also. So, as I said, I'm not pointing fingers. I'm not suggesting that any of this is actually happening now. But if push came to shove, if things became critical, if the Russians really did find themselves short of something, they have plenty of places where they can find substitutes which are at least equivalent in capability to whatever it is that the West can provide. It is one of the fundamental inabilities that Westerners, many Western commentators have, is that they continue to assume in this conflict that they're taking on Russia by itself, and ignoring the fact that Russia is now located within this complex web of trading and commercial and business and trade relationships. And they, of course, also ignore the fact, or seem unable to grasp the fact, that if we're talking about technological and industrial capabilities, whatever historic advantages the West might have had in, say, the 50s or 60s or 70s, today, in the world that we live in now, when so much of what we use and consume is produced in China and in Asia, in those sort of places, the West no longer has, if it ever really did, the kind of monopoly on expertise that these articles in the Financial Times imagine. Anyway, that is another article in the Financial Times. Let's put aside this fallacy about the West being able to help the Ukrainians outmatch the Russians in jamming capability. The West has, as I said, repeatedly tried to help the Ukrainians match or surpass the Russians in every conceivable type of weapon. They've failed up to this point. I suspect, again, that in jamming capability, the gap will again grow. And not just in jamming, but in counter-jamming as well. And since we are talking about Western articles, we've had another very interesting one from Colonel Richard Kemp in the Daily Telegraph. Now, Colonel Kemp is an enthusiastic supporter for Ukraine. He is, as his title shows, a former British military officer. He is somebody who has visited Ukraine several times over the course of this war, and someone who has been very, very optimistic at various times about Ukraine's prospects. Now, again, I am not going to read the entire article, but let's start with the title. The title reads, Tired Zelensky looks too weak to achieve victory. With splits emerging in Ukraine, the president must focus on setting out a convincing strategy to defeat Vladimir Putin. And then we read in the first few paragraphs about things which historically Western media either ignored or denied, which was the fact that there are divisions, political divisions within Ukraine. Now it is admitted, the fact of it is admitted. So I've been on these programs I've been discussing for, well, since at least the summer of 2022, that there have been tensions between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky. I remember Gordon Hahn pointing out back in 2022 the same thing. As I say, it was always denied, but now it is admitted. And Colonel Kemp tells us there are growing public divisions between Zelensky and other political leaders, such as former President Poroshenko and Kiev Mayor Vitaly Klitschko, as a blame game builds over failures in the war so far. Again, notice the use of the word failure rather than the word defeat. We don't talk about defeat when it comes to Ukraine. We talk about failure, just as we never talk about victory in terms of Russia. We concede sometimes that the Russians have made some unimportant tactical gains, but I'm not going to discuss the semantics of these kind of articles. And then Colonel Kemp goes on to say, worse still, Zelensky and the Commander-in-Chief, General Valery Zaluzhny, also seem to be in conflict. When Zaluzhny admitted that the war had reached a stalemate, Zelensky publicly rebuked him. And then there's much discussion in the article about how bad this is. The article admits that President Zelensky apparently overpromised on the summer offensive. So, by the way, did Colonel Kemp, and lots of others, but again, I'm not going to dwell on that. It also, again, speaks of alarm at the possible prospect of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. That is something apparently to be rejected at all costs. It reiterates the old exhausted myth that Biden and the Europeans have refused so far to equip Ukraine to win the war. This, when American ammunition stocks are exhausted, when Patriot missile stocks are exhausted, when the German army is in a terrible condition, when the British army is out of weapons. Nonetheless, apparently, and this is again very much the alibi that people like Colonel Kemp have fallen back on, the only reason the war in Ukraine is being lost is not because of anything the Russians have done. The Russians haven't done anything right. It is because, for some unknown reason, President Biden and his officials and people in the West, in Western Europe, have decided that they're not going to provide Ukraine with enough so that it can win the war. It is a ridiculous idea, but it is now becoming, for many people in the West, as I said, the alibi behind which they hide. And then Colonel Kemp makes what, to my mind, is the admission, which is that he has no plan. So far, Zelensky has not put forward any real strategy beyond suggesting that the centre of gravity should shift to Crimea and the Black Sea while defending against potential Russian advances in the east, which, as Brian Beletic pointed out some weeks ago, is simply the same strategy as the one that Ukraine followed in 2023 and the one which was defeated or failed. And Colonel Kemp says this is not good enough if Zelensky expects the West to keep putting its hands in its pockets. And he says that President Zelensky needs to stop the malaise. With this year's elections unlikely to go ahead in the midst of conflict, he should form a national unity government to help control the increasingly corrosive domestic dissent that can only weaken Ukraine's war effort. He should also set out his country's unified strategic vision. And then the article admits that he hasn't done that, and Zelensky may be drained by almost 2 years of war, but he must now focus on regaining the initiative. No explanation, of course, of how he's supposed to do that, what new grand strategy he's supposed to come up with, what great plan is going to turn the war round. Now, actually, some suggestions have been made. I discussed extensively in my program yesterday about how the latest idea, which seems to be gaining traction, is to supply Ukraine with long-range missiles so that it can carry out strikes on what is indisputable Russian territory. Brian Beletic has done another outstanding article simply taking that idea to pieces, which he does, if I may say, with skill, his usual forensic skill. And having said that, we've had further confirmation that this is indeed the latest plan from no less a person than Marcus Söder, the minister-president of Bavaria. He's come forward and has now said that Germany should go ahead and provide its long-range Taurus missile to Ukraine. Söder says that with this missile, Ukraine will be able to repel constant drone and missile strikes, and that this is the only chance for Ukraine to find new courage and for the Russians not to win. Now, why providing Ukraine with Taurus missiles so that it can perhaps strike at places like Novorossiysk or Rostov or wherever? Why that is going to change anything on the battlefronts, why it is going to, and how it is going to enable Ukraine to repel drone and missile strikes for Russia. I would have thought, if anything, missile strikes on Russia are going to lead the Russians to intensify their own drone and missile strikes on Ukraine. But never mind. As I said, the logic here completely escapes me. But we see that Marcus Söder is coming up with this proposal, and it's gaining an increasing amount of traction. And I suspect when the Taurus missiles are supplied to Ukraine, and when they fail completely, as they will, then as night follows day, we will see some people coming forward and saying, well, the Taurus missiles are not enough. For one thing, there's only a relatively small number of them. No more than about 600 apparently have been produced. And bear in mind The Russians are supposed to have used around 500 cruise missiles in their various strikes on Ukraine since the start of January of this year. Just saying, or at least since the start. Well, let's go back a bit. In January and December, as I said, just saying. Anyway, when it becomes clear that the Taurus missiles are not a game changer, that they're not going to achieve the results that Marcus Zerda tells us that they will, I suspect that as night follows day, we will see demands from some people that what Ukraine really needs are even more long-range missiles, so let's supply them with American Tomahawk missiles. And at that point, there will no doubt be opposition from the Pentagon, and of course, if the Congress is not providing funding, which it might not be, there will be pressure to get from the Pentagon. They'll say that they can't supply these missiles. But of course, if the Europeans do come up with more money, if the Russian reserves are indeed seized, I would not be surprised if we start to see European orders in the United States to buy Tomahawk missiles to supply them to Ukraine. It won't make any difference. As I said, I discussed that in my previous program, and Brian Beletic does it with much more skill and erudition and knowledge than I do in his recent program in the New Atlas. So there we go. That's, as I said, the strategy, and to the extent that we have a strategy, and we will see whether it's ever carried out. Anyway, no Christmas truce in Ukraine. Russia continuing to conduct its policy of aggressive attrition. Almost certainly more big Russian missile strikes on the way. And who knows, at some point, probably a big Russian knockout blow. Even people like Colonel Kemp can see that the writing is on the wall. They demand of President Zelensky the impossible. They continue to rule out negotiations. But though they complain that President Zelensky hasn't come up with a strategy to win the war, they, of course, don't come up with such a strategy either, except propose things like supply Ukraine with long-range missiles, which will only make Ukraine's situation even worse. And the one thing they all seem to be united about is that negotiations with the Russians cannot happen. Now, I'm going to finish this program with two quick things. Firstly, Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, perhaps also reading the fact that the writing is on the wall, that there is a debacle in Ukraine coming. He's apparently decided that he's going to step down as President of the European Council, which I understand nominally would mean that no less a person than Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, would step in as caretaker. Well, we will see whether he does indeed step down and who does take his place, but it looks like the Zelensky curse, as my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has named it. It looks as if the Zelensky curse is about to get itself a fresh victim. The other thing I wanted to say, ever much more importantly, is that I have now received a private email from a very important source, also discussing, again, the missile strikes on the 29th of December and the 3rd of January against Kiev, and in particular focusing on the strike that took place on the 3rd of January. Now, there was an enormous amount of information in this email, very valuable and important information indeed, which highlighted many aspects of this missile strike. Now, unfortunately, this is one of those situations where I feel that if I start providing too much detail about what was in this email, I might disclose information about the source. So I am not going to do so. All I will say is this information provides a great deal of explanation about the strategy that the Russians adopted over the course of this missile attack. Secondly, it is clear that the missile attack was indeed primarily targeting Ukraine's air defense system. Thirdly, it was enormously effective in doing that, and the Russians did succeed in conducting massive damage on that air defense system, and in particular on its control systems, the places where the operators were located, that kind of thing. And lastly, my guess that the Russian hacking attacks on the mobile phone system were in some way connected to this missile strike and provided some explanation for its effectiveness. It seems that those speculations are substantiated, are grounded on fact. Now, I'm afraid I can't say more, but what I will say is this: assuming that the information that has been provided to me, which I believe to be reliable, is indeed reliable, and I am confident that it is, then all of the signs of panic, the shock, the dismay, the alarm expressed by General Zaluzhny in his meeting with the members of the Rada, all of that is fully explained. In fact, there is a crisis in Ukraine's air defense system, and I suspect that crisis is going to deepen from this point forward. Anyway, that's all I can say, except, of course, to thank the person who has provided this invaluable information, which I take note of, and which, as he correctly says, when you compare what the information that he's providing with what we know from public sources, it is clear to me that it is correct. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. Now, I'm going to finish this video by turning to another topic, which is the application that the South African government has made to the International Court of Justice. Now, I have read the plaint that South Africa has brought. It is over 80 pages long. It is very, very closely argued. Clearly, some extremely able lawyers have worked with the South Africans to put together this plaint. It goes into much of the history of the conflict in Gaza. It explains a lot of the background, going back many years, about what the Israeli actions were in Gaza, which brought about the situation which has led to the complaint. And, as I very much anticipated and have repeatedly warned about, it cites comments made by Israeli officials, including cabinet ministers, and including, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, in support of the claims that it is making about potential, about genocide, a plan to conduct genocide on the part of Israel. Now, the plaint seeks an expedited decision. I have to say, reading this plaint, and I want to stress again, this is not an area of which I have a huge amount of expertise, but reading the plaint, if the International Court of Justice accepts it, then I would have thought that the Israeli government is more likely than not to lose. It's going to be very, very difficult to argue against some of the points that have been made here, given the statements that so many Israeli officials have made. And I have to quickly add that there has been a public row within the Israeli cabinet between the Israeli Defense Minister, Mr. Gantz, and some of the more hardline members of the cabinet, and they have inevitably resulted in extraordinary statements by people like Mr. Ben Gvir and the Israeli Finance Minister, Mr. Smotrich, which, to be straightforward about it, some of the things that have been said, especially by Smotrich, I would say, lend further weight to this plaint. Now, again, I don't know whether these people, Smotrich or Ben Gvir, understand that, or whether they even care. But, you know, if I was advising them, which I'm glad to say I am not, I would have thought that any lawyer advising them would by now be advising them to choose their words more carefully. But for the moment, at least, they don't seem to be doing that. Anyway, there it is. I think that there is a strong arguable case here. And as the plaint points out, both Israel and South Africa are parties to the relevant conventions. And clearly the International Court of Justice does have jurisdiction. Now, the two things that I don't know are firstly whether the International Court of Justice will accept this plaint. I think the weakest point in the claim is the fact that it has been brought not by an injured party, but by a third party, which is, of course, South Africa. However, we are talking about a plaint referencing genocide. The plaint makes the point that there is a major international obligation to prevent that happening. If things were to proceed in a objective, shall we say, in an impartial way, I would have thought that would be enough for the court to accept a plaint coming from South Africa. But of course, I don't know that that will happen, and it will be the decision of the court. If the court does accept this plaint, if it is proceeded with, then, as I said, I think that Israel, despite the fact that they've now appointed an extremely capable British lawyer to defend them, are going to be very much on the back foot on this one. The other thing that I would say is that it will be for the court to decide whether to grant an expedited hearing or not. Again, given the nature of the issue which is being talked about here, genocide, one would have thought that an expedited hearing would be essential. But then again, one can't be certain that that will happen. And of course, it can only happen if the court decides to accept the plane in the first place. So those are my preliminary views. And I want to stress again, I am not an expert either in the procedures of the International Court of Justice, nor in the relevant laws. And anybody who wants to disagree with everything that I've just said is welcome to do so. But anyway, that is my immediate and initial take on this. The last point I will make, however, is this. If the court does accept this plaint, even if it takes a while before a final decision is made, then the embarrassment for Western governments, particularly one suspects European governments, especially, I'm guessing, the German government, is going to be extreme. They're going to find it very, very difficult indeed to explain this decision, such a decision away. I've already seen an article in the Daily Telegraph. Again, I'm not going to quote from it, but it's already complaining that the International Court of Justice is being weaponized against Israel, which, as I said, given the way in which other international tribunals have worked in the past, as many would say, to promote Western interests, does seem to me a bit of a case of complaining about something being done which is done regularly and which you've never complained about when it is done on your own behalf. But never mind. But as I said, if the court accepts this complaint, the embarrassment will be acute. And of course, it does go for an expedited hearing, as logically it should. And if that hearing does result in a judgment against Israel, which on the facts of this plaint, I think it quite plausibly may, well, that embarrassment is going to be multiplied by orders of magnitude. I would have thought that it is very much in the interests of the Western states not to let this happen. Now, I'm afraid that does open up various possibilities, though it shouldn't happen. Though I can say for a fact that it does. I suspect that there will be intense lobbying from the Western powers upon the International Court of Justice to either refuse to take this case, to deny jurisdiction, or to slow walk it as much as possible. The International Court of Justice is located in The Hague, which of course is the Netherlands in Western Europe, and it is, like most courts, largely funded by Western states, all of which should not mean anything, but of course they do. So who knows? But a more logical, a more proper thing is to try to avoid this happening by doing that which I have always urged, which is support a ceasefire in Gaza and look for some way to de-escalate the situation in the Middle East. Well, that might be the logical course, but I doubt that Western governments will follow it. I will finish by saying that if, of course, the International Court of Justice does come to a finding against Israel on this plane and issues a judgment to that effect, then I cannot see how in that case the International Criminal Court could continue to avoid issuing indictments its reputation has already, in my opinion, been seriously damaged by its refusal to take steps in the face of this crisis. If there is a decision by the International Court of Justice, a much more well-established court with a very, very strong jurisprudence behind it, well, if following such a finding, the ICC continues to sit on its hands, then its future basically ends, as its reputation will be held under the waterline beyond recovery. Anyway, that's what I want to say about this. I want to stress again, I'm not an expert in these matters. Anybody who wishes and wants to disagree with the points I've made, I'd be very interested to see what they have to say. About the general situation in the Middle East, all I will say is that we now wait upon the decisions which are going to be made in Jerusalem and Washington, and which will no doubt start to emerge over the next few days. This is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. You can find all the amazing things that that are there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. As a happy Christmas to whoever is enjoying Christmas on this day. And, well, we'll see what happens. And whatever it is, I will be discussing it in my next program.